Comic books for years were considered a juvenile medium, and that sensibility often extended to the behavior of the practitioners in the field. Like people who work in any other industry, not all comic book creators get along, and on occasion some of them have felt the need to take their aggressions out in public in the pages of a comic book story they were working on. It's not really great professional behavior, but it led to some memorable comic book stories. So here are 5 truly mean caricatures of comic book creators by their peers. Number 1. Funky Flashman, Mr. Miracle, number 6. The granddaddy of all these caricatures, and one that was in no way concealed from the audience given how prominent a personality Stan Lee was even then. After a decade of toiling for Marvel, creating the very substance of the Marvel Universe, Jack Kirby had had enough. His migration to DC was meant to be his great escape from the plantation, but things didn't work out for him quite so wonderfully. Nobody is 100% certain just what set him off 2 years after his departure, but whatever the reason, the rage and frustration that the King of Comics was feeling towards his erstwhile boss and partner bubbled over in the pages of his Mr. Miracle series. In the 6th issue, he produced a savage parody of Stan Lee in the person of Funky Flashman, a fraud and con man who seeks to profit off of Scott Free's talent and then discard him when his usefulness is up. Kirby is merciless in his characterization of Lee here. He's also got shade to throw at Lee's number 2, Roy Thomas, whom he depicts as House Roy, Funky's sycophantic servant who dreams of inheriting the family business once Funky moves on to greater things. I think it can certainly be argued that Kirby was justified in many of his feelings, and his talent and passion is all over this issue. But one of the things that doesn't get mentioned enough when it's talked about is just how mean it is. It's brutal and vicious and spiteful and just a hair unprofessional. Astonishingly, it would only be 3 years until Kirby would find himself back working under Lee and alongside Thomas, who both seemed willing to let bygones be bygones if it meant securing Kirby's services for Marvel once again. Number 2. Phil Binger, The Amazing World of DC Comics, number 10. Bill Finger was the co-creator of Batman, Green Lantern, and Wildcat, among other characters, and he contributed to the welfare of DC Comics consistently until his untimely passing in 1974. He was also a chronic procrastinator who lived from check to check, and his constant begging for an advance on his paycheck annoyed somebody at DC, likely editor Joe Orlando, enough that this incredibly cruel story was commissioned. Here, Finger is incarnated as Phil Binger, a comic book writer whose best stories are the ones he tells his editors to get an advance on his money, and who even haunts them from beyond the grave. This tale was prepared either right before Bill Finger died or right after. Either way, it's in pretty terrible taste. It was intended for plop, but wiser heads prevailed, and it was pulled, seeing print only in DC's house fanzine, The Amazing World of DC Comics. Even so, it is mean beyond belief, and one has to assume that writer David Verne and artist Ramona Fradon understood what they were doing here. All that said, like the Funky Flashman story, it's incredibly entertaining, but becomes profoundly disturbing when you decode its underlying meaning. Earlier, Finger had been the subject of a much more neutral pastiche when he was used as the model for Green Lantern's villain, Black Hand. Number 3. Booster Cogburn, The Dislocated Spine, Destroyer Duck number 2. Eclipse's Destroyer Duck series started out as a benefit comic book to support author Steve Gerber in his lawsuit with Marvel to regain the rights to his creation, Howard the Duck. Jack Kirby agreed to draw the first issue for free in support of Gerber's cause. And after that initial release performed well, a regular series was commissioned, pitting Duke Duck against the operatives of the evil conglomerate God Corps, whose motto was grab it all, own it all, drain it all. The second issue introduced Booster Cogburn, an incredibly multi-layered pun of a name on Gerber's part, who referred to himself as a company man and whose spine would burst out of his body whenever he was killed and eventually get transplanted into a new one. During Gerber's lawsuit, John Byrne had written a guest editorial for Comic Scene magazine that poo-pooed Gerber's arguments and positions. In it, he attested to being a happy cog in the Marvel machine, so Gerber and Kirby ridiculed him mercilessly over the course of a number of issues, often putting only slightly tweaked quotes from Byrne's own essay into Cogburn's mouth to skewer him. There's no love lost here. The takedown is brutal and merciless and mean, but it's also pretty clever, it must be said. Number 4. Stuart Cadwell, Thundersword, Secret Wars 2, number 1. What goes around sometimes comes around, and it wasn't long after Destroyer Duck that Steve Gerber found himself on the receiving end of a nasty skewering from Marvel Editor-in-Chief Jim Shooter and artist Al Milgrom. In the first issue of Secret Wars 2, they introduced Stuart Cadwell, itself a multiple pun name, a hard-working hack writer and pacifist who aspires to greater things until the Beyonder enchants his Shazam award, transforming him into Thundersword. Gerber had been one of the chief architects of the Thundar the Barbarian cartoon. With his newfound power, Cadwell becomes a bully, immediately selling out his values and heedlessly obliterating the animation studio where he works, as revenge for the unwanted notes they had given him. In other words, he's a hypocrite. The satire isn't especially subtle here. Given the difficulty of his then recent relations with Gerber, it's hard to see this as anything other than Shooter's frustrations manifesting on the page. But especially for the editor-in-chief, it's incredibly poor form. The story was continued into issues of Iron Man, where writer Denny O'Neil seems embarrassed by the whole thing. In later years, Shooter has claimed that Gerber was in on the joke and loved it, and maybe he was, but this is still a shitty way to treat a creator who's working for you. Number 5, Sunspot, Legends number 5. And speaking of the wheel turning, it's difficult to say who was responsible for Sunspot. One would assume that plotter John Ostrander came up with the character, but I'd stake my life that this was the idea of artist John Byrne, who had just left Marvel on acrimonious terms due to his conflicts with the editor-in-chief Jim Shooter, whom he characterized as a petty tyrant. In any event, this line-wide DC crossover series took a 4-page detour so that these creators, along with scripter Len Wein, could crap on Shooter in the form of Sunspot, a very thinly disguised parody of Shooter's semi-autobiographical Marvel creation, Starbrand. Fans had always labeled Starbrand as a third-rate knockoff of Green Lantern, so here, asshole Green Lantern Guy Gardner comes into conflict with Sunspot, who rails about his own great power before accidentally blowing his own foot off. Sunspot is particularly cruelly drawn as having the same acne-scarred features as Shooter himself, so as to make the connection more overt. It's kind of funny if you're an insider, and I suppose you could have read the sequence completely on the surface if you had no context for it, but it's a grim waste of real estate to no great effect other than insulting the competition's head guy. But Shooter at this point was reviled by many, and so I suspect this seemed like just desserts to some. Not satisfied with this cheap shot, Byrne would go on to take over Starbrand after Shooter's departure from Marvel, and he delighted in killing the character in the most painful and ignominious ways, issue after issue, his Starbrand power bringing him back to life every time, ready to be killed and mocked afresh. You kind of like to hope that these sorts of broad parodies of competing creators are a thing of the past, that we wouldn't do these kinds of stories again today. But it's almost inevitable that somebody's going to do it again. Until that happens, I'm Tom Brevoort. Thanks for watching.